Camille gritted her teeth as she adjusted the price tag on the small canvas painting in front of her $10. It was worth at least 100, maybe more, but no one in this part of town would pay that much, and she needed to eat tonight. The wind cut through her thin jacket as she stood behind the wobbly table she had set up on the sidewalk. Her small collection of paintings spread out in a desperate attempt to catch a buyer's eye. The city buzzed around her, people rushing past without a glance. "Excuse me," came a deep voice. She looked up to find a man in an expensive charcoal coat standing in front of her table, his piercing green eyes scanning her artwork. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had an air of effortless confidence. He didn't belong here, not in this part of the city where struggling artists barely scraped by. "This one," he said, pointing to the $10 painting. "You made this," Camille nodded. "Yeah." His gaze flickered over her, assessing. "You're underselling yourself." She let out a dry laugh. "Tell that to my landlord." Without another word, he pulled out his wallet, took out a crisp 20, and set it on the table. "It's only 10, she said, surprised. "Keep the change." Before she could protest, he picked up the painting and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Camille stared after him, heart pounding. Who was this man, and why did he look at her like he knew something she didn't? She shook off the thought and pocketed the money. It wasn't much, but it was enough for dinner. That was all that mattered. But what Camille didn't know was that the painting she had just sold for $10 was now in the hands of Adrian Sinclair, a millionaire investor with a sharp eye for talent. And he hadn't just bought the painting, he had bought the artist, and he wasn't about to let her go unnoticed. Camille wiped her hands on her jeans as she stepped back from the canvas, studying the brushstrokes. The tiny apartment was cramped, the single window barely letting in enough light, but it was all she could afford. She sighed, pushing away the nagging thought that she'd have to sell this piece for far less than it was worth too. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitating for just a second, she crossed the room and pulled it open. The man from the street stood there, her breath caught. He looked even more out of place now, standing in the dim hallway of her building, his tailored coat sharp against the peeling paint of the walls. "How did you?" I asked around, he said simply, as if that explained everything. "Camille, right?" She hesitated before nodding. "I have a proposition for you." She folded her arms, wary. "I don't do commissions." He let out a low chuckle. "This is something different." She stepped aside reluctantly, letting him in. Her apartment was embarrassingly small, cluttered with canvases and paint supplies. He took it all in with a single sweep of his gaze before turning back to her. "I'm Adrian Sinclair." The name sent a jolt through her. She didn't follow business news, but she had heard it before. Sinclair Investments, real estate, art acquisitions. He wasn't just wealthy, he was in a different world entirely. "And what exactly does a millionaire investor want with a struggling artist?" she asked, crossing her arms. His lips twitched, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You don't belong here," she scoffed. "That's not your call to make." "No," he agreed, "but I can help you get where you should be." She narrowed her eyes. "And why would you do that?" He leaned against the wall, completely at ease. "Because I saw something in that painting I bought from you. I know talent when I see it. You're wasting yours here." Her fingers tightened around her arms. No one had ever said that to her before, not like this, not with certainty. "I don't take handouts," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't a handout," he countered. "It's an opportunity. I want to sponsor you, give you the resources to create without worrying about survival." Her heart pounded. "And what do you get out of it?" He held her gaze. "Your work, your success, and maybe the satisfaction of proving you wrong." She didn't know whether to be offended or intrigued. "I don't trust deals that sound too good," she said cautiously. He nodded as if he respected her hesitation. "Then let me prove it's real. Come to dinner with me tomorrow, we'll talk details." She hesitated. "Dinner? At a gallery. There's an event. You should see what your competition looks like." Her stomach twisted. He was offering her something she had only dreamed of, but the question remained, why her? She studied him, searching for a hidden agenda, but all she saw was confidence, certainty. Before she could talk herself out of it, she nodded. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable. "I'll send a car," he said simply before turning to leave. Camille closed the door behind him, pressing her back against it. What had she just agreed to? Camille adjusted the sleek black dress that had arrived at her door earlier that day. She didn't own anything remotely this elegant, and she had debated for hours whether to even wear it. The note attached had been simple: "Wear this, trust me." Now, as she stepped into the grand entrance of the gallery, she realized why Adrian had sent it. The room glittered with wealth chandeliers casting golden light over polished floors, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne, and men and women in designer attire discussing art with the kind of practiced ease that came from privilege. She felt completely out of place. Then Adrian appeared. He was dressed in a sharp midnight blue suit, perfectly tailored, exuding effortless confidence. The moment he saw her, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but something quieter, something that made her pulse quicken. "You clean up well," he said, offering his arm. She hesitated before taking it, letting him guide her deeper into the room. As they moved among the guests, whispers followed. People recognized Adrian, of course, but the curiosity in their eyes was directed at her. "Why do I feel like an exhibit?" she muttered under her breath. Adrian glanced at her, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Because they're wondering who you are. And soon they'll know." Before she could question that, they stopped in front of a striking abstract piece, bold with color and movement. A silver-haired man turned toward them, his expression shifting from polite interest to recognition when he saw Adrian. "Sinclair," the man greeted, shaking Adrian's hand. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I make exceptions for talent," Adrian replied smoothly, then gestured to Camille. "This is Camille Laurent." "An artist you'll want to keep an eye on." Camille stiffened. Just like that, he was throwing her into the spotlight. The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze appraising. "Laurent. I'm not familiar with the name." "You will be," Adrian said, his tone absolute. The man hummed, then turned to Camille. "What's your medium?" She swallowed her nerves. "Mostly oil on canvas." "But I experiment with mixed media." "Interesting." His eyes searched hers, assessing. "And where can I see your work?" She hesitated. Her work wasn't in galleries. It was on street corners, sold for whatever she could get. But before she could answer, Adrian spoke again. "She's exclusive for now," he said smoothly. "But I'm certain that will change soon." The man gave a knowing nod. "If Sinclair is endorsing you, I'll be watching." With that, he moved on, but Camille barely noticed. She turned to Adrian, lowering her voice. "Exclusive." He met her gaze, unwavering. "You're not some struggling artist anymore, Camille. You're someone worth noticing." Her heart pounded. "You can't just decide that." "I don't have to. I simply make sure the right people see what's already there." Before she could argue, a woman in a shimmering gown approached, pulling Adrian into a brief conversation. Camille took a steadying breath, her mind spinning. Every instinct told her to resist this, to fight against the idea that she could belong in this world, but the way Adrian had spoken about her, it unsettled something deep inside her. Because for the first time, someone believed in her potential before she even had the chance to prove it herself. Camille's pulse quickened as Adrian placed a glass of champagne in her hand. The gallery around them hummed with conversation, but she barely heard it. Her mind was still reeling from the way Adrian had spoken about her, the way he had seamlessly woven her into this world as if she had always belonged. "You're quiet," Adrian observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She exhaled slowly, turning toward him. "I'm still trying to figure you out." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "And what have you decided?" "That you don't do anything without a reason." A slow smile tugged at his lips. "Perceptive," she studied him carefully. Why me, Adrian? You could have chosen any artist, ones with connections, with galleries lined up. But you picked me, someone who was selling paintings on the street. His expression didn't waver. Because I don't care about connections, I care about talent. And you have more of it than half the artists in this room combined. Warmth spread through her chest, but she refused to let it cloud her judgment. That's not the only reason. His fingers brushed the rim of his glass, thoughtful. No, it's not. Her breath hitched slightly. I admire people who fight for what they want, he continued. You didn't wait for an opportunity to come to you. You put your work out there no matter the circumstances. That kind of determination is rare. She swallowed, her throat tightening. No one had ever spoken about her like this. Not as if she were just another struggling artist, but as if she were someone worth betting on. And what do you want in return? She asked quietly. He held her gaze, unwavering, for you to let yourself be seen. Something in her chest clenched. Before she could respond, an older woman in an emerald gown approached, her keen eyes flicking between them. Adrian, darling, I was hoping to steal a moment of your time. Camille took a step back, giving them space, but Adrian's hand gently caught her wrist, a barely there touch that sent a shiver through her. Excuse us, Eleanor, I'm occupied. Eleanor's eyes twinkled with curiosity, lingering on Camille for a moment before she gracefully drifted away. Camille exhaled a shaky breath. You didn't have to do that. I did, he countered smoothly, because I'm not done talking to you. Her heart pounded. Before she could gather her thoughts, he nodded toward the far end of the gallery. Come with me. She hesitated, but something about the quiet intensity in his gaze made her follow. He led her down a hallway, away from the crowd, until they reached a private exhibit space. Inside, a single painting hung on the wall, her breath caught. It was hers. The painting she had sold for $10. Now framed, perfectly lit, standing in a gallery where it truly belonged. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. You did this, he nodded. Her emotions swirled shock, gratitude, something deeper she couldn't name. Why? Because your work deserves to be seen, he said simply. And because I wanted to be the first to showcase it. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Camille, he said softly, stepping closer. His voice was different now, lower, more intimate. You keep waiting for someone to tell you you're good enough, but you already are. Her breath shuddered. No one had ever seen her like this. Not just as an artist, but as a person. And as Adrian watched her, his expression unreadable yet intense, she realized something terrifyingly undeniable. She was falling for him. And she wasn't sure she could stop. Camille stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the painting hanging in the gallery. The weight of what Adrian had done settled over her, pressing against her ribs like a held breath. He hadn't just bought her artwork, he had elevated it, given it a place of honor, made a statement to the world that she was worth more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. She turned to him, her pulse thrumming. There was something about the way he watched her, not just with admiration, but with certainty, as if he had always known she was meant for something greater. You didn't have to do this, she finally said, her voice quieter than she intended. Adrian's expression remained unreadable, but his posture shifted slightly, like he was weighing his words before speaking. I wanted to. She searched his face for any trace of arrogance or ulterior motive, but all she found was sincerity. That made it even harder to comprehend. I don't know how to accept this, she admitted. His gaze never wavered. Then don't think of it as accepting something. Think of it as stepping into what was already yours. A lump formed in her throat. How was it so easy for him to believe in her when she had spent years convincing herself she wasn't enough? Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. Adrian. I should have known you had something up your sleeve. A man in his 50s approached, his charcoal suit impeccable, his sharp gaze flickering from Adrian to Camille. There was a knowing familiarity in the way he addressed Adrian, but when his eyes landed on the painting, his expression shifted. This is hers, Adrian nodded. It is. The man took a step closer to the painting, studying it with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands before. Camille braced herself for skepticism, for dismissal, but instead he turned back to Adrian with something like intrigue. "You always did have an eye for hidden talent." Camille clenched her hands together, her stomach twisting. She had spent so long trying to prove herself to disinterested faces, to gallery owners who barely glanced at her portfolio. And now, with one act, Adrian had placed her in a position she had never even dared to dream of. But why? When the man moved on, Adrian turned back to her, his expression softer now. "People will come to you after this," she exhaled sharply. "That's what I'm afraid of." His brow furrowed slightly. "Why?" "Because, what if I'm not ready?" Adrian's gaze held steady. "You are." She wanted to believe him, wanted to let this moment sink into her bones and overwrite the years of doubt, but something about it all felt too fast, too surreal. Still, when Adrian offered his hand, she took it. The night blurred into a series of introductions, conversations that felt like a whirlwind, a world she had never been a part of but was suddenly swept into. And through it all, Adrian remained by her side, his presence steady, as if he was anchoring her to this new reality. By the time they stepped out onto the quiet street, the city's night air cool against her skin, Camille felt like she had stepped into someone else's life. She turned to Adrian, searching his face for something, an explanation, a reason why he had done all of this for her. But before she could speak, he said, "I don't do things halfway, Camille." Something in his voice sent a shiver down her spine, and "I don't believe in letting talent go unnoticed." Her heart pounded. She should have been overwhelmed, should have wanted to run back to the familiar struggle of scraping by. But standing here, with Adrian looking at her like she was already someone, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to go back. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to walk away from him either. The city lights stretched endlessly before them as Adrian's car wove through the streets, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Camille sat beside him, her fingers grazing the edge of her dress, her mind still spinning from the night's events. She had stepped into a world she never imagined herself belonging to, and yet she hadn't drowned. She had kept up, held her own. And Adrian. Adrian had been at her side the entire time, guiding her without ever making her feel small. His hand rested on the leather seat between them, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. The tension in the car was thick, charged with something unspoken. She turned her head slightly, studying him in the dim glow of passing streetlights. He looked composed as always, but there was something else, a quiet intensity in the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers tapped once against his knee as if he was holding something back. The car slowed as they approached her apartment. The moment the wheels stopped, she hesitated, fingers brushing the door handle but not pressing it. "I should thank you," she said finally. Adrian turned his head toward her, the weight of his gaze settling over her. "For what?" She let out a breath. "For everything you did tonight, for putting my work out there." "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said, his voice even. She swallowed. "That's what I don't understand. You barely knew me when you decided to do all of this. Why take a risk on someone like me?" His fingers curled slightly against the seat. "Because I see something in you, Camille, something undeniable." Her heart pounded. "You talk about my art like it's the only thing that matters, but it's more than that, isn't it?" His silence stretched, heavy with meaning. She turned fully toward him, her pulse thrumming in her throat. "Tell me I'm wrong." He didn't. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver through her. "I don't make a habit of getting involved like this," he admitted, his voice quieter now, rougher. "But you're different." She felt like the air in the car had thinned, like she was balancing on the edge of something neither of them could ignore any longer. Adrian. His name on her lips was barely a whisper, but it unraveled something in him. Before she could think, before she could second-guess, his hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that stole the breath from her lungs. There was nothing hesitant about it. It was deep, certain like he had been holding back for too long, and now that he had her, he wasn't letting go. She melted into him, her hands gripping the lapels of his jacket as the world outside disappeared. There was only the warmth of him, the way he tilted her head just enough to deepen the kiss, the way his fingers tightened against her skin as if he wanted to memorize the shape of her. When they finally pulled apart, her breath was uneven, her heart hammering against her ribs. Adrian's forehead rested lightly against hers, his voice low. "Tell me to stop and I will." She could have. She could have walked away, pretended this was nothing more than gratitude, nothing more than an artist thanking her benefactor. But that would have been a lie. "I don't want you to stop," she whispered. His breath hitched, and then he kissed her again, slower this time, as if sealing something between them. Whatever this was, whatever had been building between them from the moment he had bought that painting, it wasn't just business. It had never been just business. And now, there was no going back. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Her name was suddenly on the lips of people she had only ever read about. Calls came in, gallery owners wanting meetings, collectors asking about her work. Adrian had opened a door for her, and instead of hesitating, she stepped through it. But through it all, he remained constant. They spent nights in his penthouse, Camille painting as he worked, the silence between them comfortable. Dinners turned into long conversations, stolen glances turning into something deeper. It wasn't just passion, though there was plenty of that. It was something solid, something real. And when her first official gallery show opened, when she stood in a room filled with people admiring her work, Adrian at her side, she realized something. She hadn't just found success. She had found him. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next.